Hello, Shalom. Welcome to our second day of the New Testament introduction, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And today we shall go to the second part of Matthew and Mark, actually the one of last week, more than being introducing to us Matthew and Mark, it's more of introducing to us the New Testament and the Gospel. Now we go to the books or the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, and we shall begin with the Gospel of Mark. Since in my own opinion also, I go with the Markan priority. I go with that theory, how we have solved, in a way, the synoptic problem, Markan priority, and of course, there's another hypothetical source, and that is Q. But let's go to this part, the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. And I'd like to read it in Greek so that we get to have a feel of how it is said, how it is written. Arketu Evangeliou Jesu Christou Huiou Theou. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Naturally, if you see Christou, that's Christ, and then Jesu, Jesus, and then Huiou Theou, Son of God. And so what does it mean? That right at the beginning, Mark introduces his gospel with this. This is the good news. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He tells us who Jesus is. And we focus on that part, Christ, Christos, which is connected to the middle part of the gospel, Mark 8:29. Apokrites ho Petros legei auto sui ho Christos. And that is translated into, Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And that is in the context of Jesus asking his disciples when they were here at Caesarea Philippi, the north. And he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" And he got several answers, John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. But the more important question is, "But who do you say that I am?" And this is the answer. You are the Messiah. So at the beginning, we see the gospel of Jesus Christ. Christ is Messiah. And in the middle, you are the Messiah, making us think that, yes, this gospel tells us who Jesus is. And then on further, when we look at this particular gospel, Mark 8:31, immediately after that response, "You are the Christ," then Mark continues. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and be killed. And after 3 days, rise again. The prediction of the Passion. And of course, about Son of God, when we look at Mark 1:11, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I'm well pleased." Mark 1:24, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And this came from the demon who was exorcised, okay, who has been sent out from the one who was possessed. Mark 5:7, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" See, even these demons who were possessing people, they knew who he was, the Son of God, the Holy One of God. And then in Mark 9:7, it is a reinforcement of what was said of him by the Father himself. Here in the context of the Transfiguration, if Mark 1:11 is the baptism, here at the Transfiguration, "This is my Son, the beloved, listen to him." And so Jesus being introduced. And then towards the end of the gospel, we have only 16 chapters of Mark. We read in Mark 15:39, "Alethos utos so anthropos huios theou en." Truly, this man was God's Son. So it was a profession of faith by the centurion. It's a theme in Mark that when Jesus died, that was the time that the centurion proclaimed, this was God's Son. In the death of Jesus, is seen his being divine, being God's Son. Now, let's look at the outline of the Gospel of Mark. If we see it as 16 chapters from verse 1 of chapter 1, and then towards the end of 15, and that means just a little bit more, it's already the end of the Gospel. You would see there, at the beginning, there was Jesus Christ, Son of God, okay? And then at the end, the profession that Jesus indeed is the Son of God by the centurion. And then at the middle, 8:29, you find there, you are Christ. And so these three important parts, the beginning, the end, and the middle. And as is always taught when one encounters the Gospel of Mark, that you find that as a hinge, the middle part of the Gospel, you are the Christ. So there's an introduction to who Jesus is at the beginning, an affirmation that he is the Christ in the middle, an affirmation that he is the Son of God at the end. So that is a very good outline of the Gospel of Mark. And then, looking at it also, chapter 1, verse 1 to 8:29. So from the beginning to the middle of the Gospel, in between you have three boat scenes. And whom do you find there? Jesus and the disciples. And there you would see, they were asking the same question, who is this man? And all throughout, they do not understand. There's the misunderstanding by the disciples, who is this man? And sometimes you get frustrated with the disciples, that they have already been witnesses of the words of Jesus and the great deeds that he was doing, and yet still they could not fathom it. So the first part of the Gospel until the middle, that's the question, who is this man? And then the second part of the Gospel, from 8:29 to 15:39, it's like we call it a sandwich, okay, inclusion, that we begin with Jesus, okay, proclaimed as Christ by Peter, as the Messiah, and then by the centurion, Son of God. Two great proclamations, and in between, there are the three passion predictions. I will not be able to show you in these slides, but I'd like to preempt, or I'd like to include it immediately, that one of the themes here in Mark is the messianic secret. That whenever you see Jesus healing, more often than not, he would say, do not tell this to anybody, that it will be a secret. Why? Because otherwise, he would be misunderstood as a Messiah. They would be looking for a Messiah who would be a political leader, who will be defending them, or who will be leading the forces against the invaders, against those who have subjugated them, a political Messiah. But he's not a political Messiah. He would have to suffer. And this one is incompatible with what the disciples were thinking, what many of the disciples and many of the people were thinking. And that's why, after he had predicted the passion the first time in Mark 8:31, then Peter wanted to talk him out of it. But of course, he stood his ground, that he also predicted in Mark 9:31, again, predicting the passion. And then in Mark 10:33 to 34, three passion predictions. So who is this man? He's the Messiah, yes, but what kind of Messiah? A Messiah who will be suffering, who will be killed, who will be put to death. And that is why Jesus did not want his healings to be broadcasted. He wanted it to be hidden, the messianic secret. Otherwise, people will be flocking to him and they will miss the point that Jesus came not as a political Messiah. And so that's the middle part, or from the middle part to the end, the passion predictions. Now, let's see. There's a lot of focus on suffering. And one of the things that we hear about when there are commentaries is the community of Mark was suffering. And this was a question of yours last week, not? Who's the audience of the Gospel of Mark? Okay, so there's a central issue, suffering. So the congregation has experienced or is about to experience persecution, led to an apocalyptic atmosphere within the community. And half the gospel deals with suffering and death. So I was telling you about that. And the focus is Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. And then Mark repeatedly refers to persecution. Like when you look at Mark 4:17 and then 10:30, and then there's a parallel verse also, Mark 13:11. So the community is caught up in a period of apocalyptic fervor. And that was occasioned by the circumstances of the Jewish war. And that was from 66 to 70 AD. And the community has forgotten the centrality of the cross in the life of discipleship. And that's why the Gospel of Mark, the preaching of Mark focused on that, the importance of the cross. It's a reminder from him of the cross and the true meaning of discipleship. So if they were becoming lax or they were becoming afraid because of suffering, Jesus also suffered. And he was telling his disciples about suffering. And so we see the problems in Mark's community. First, the authority of domination and not of service. And therefore, he would want to emphasize that. And then some were becoming rich. And then some were misunderstanding the suffering Messiah. And then also the cost of discipleship and the taking up of the cross. And there were other problems like marriage and divorce. That's why it's part of the Gospel of Mark. And then the importance of children. And then the correct understanding of Jesus and his mission. Like what we read in Mark 10, verse 45. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So, what is the socioeconomic status of Mark's audience, of Mark's community? We see that the Greek of Mark is not elegant. It's not literary Greek, but koine Greek. And koine means common. So the Greek of ordinary people. Second, the portrayal of the rich as suspect. In chapter 10, verse 23 to 25 and 42, the danger of riches. And then the ordinary items as used by the poor. We have the pallet, okay? And then the basket, the kophinos, okay? And then when Jesus would tell his disciples how hard it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God. So it's the lower economic status to which Mark was speaking. And he even spoke about the poor widow who came and she put 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. So that those in Mark 12:42, okay, the lepta duo, 2 small copper coins, and then a quadrantes, it's a quarter, okay, a penny. Now, what about the racial composition of the community of Mark? So it was composed of Jews and Gentile converts. And these lived outside Palestine and who were breaking away from traditional Jewish practices. Therefore, they were not in Palestine. Now, Jews, because there was familiarity with Jewish scriptures, and there was frequent explicit citations and allusions. However, okay, there were a lot of Gentile converts. And what is the proof of that? That when Mark quotes from the Old Testament, he quotes from the Greek versions. And then the Jewish customs, they were placed there, but he was explaining them. If he had to explain them, then there were those who were not familiar with them. And those were the Gentiles. And then Aramaic phrases are translated. Details of Palestinian geography were vague. And then there were strong attacks on Jewish laws and institutions. So that means it's a Gentile context now. And then there's an implied mission to the Gentiles. And Mark writes to a community that is predominantly, although not exclusively, Gentile Christian. And as we see in chapter 7, verse 3, they were no longer observant of the Mosaic law. Okay? Like in Mark 7, 2 to 4, you would see there, okay, Jewish customs explained. So some disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is without washing them. And then you would see in your Bibles, enclosed in parentheses, these were meant to explain by Mark. He meant to explain what is that? Washing the hands. And then he explains there's also the tradition that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. Now, about Aramaic phrases translated, Mark 7:34, then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Okay, even the Greek, you see it here, Ephphatha. Okay. Now, another point, details of Palestinian geography were vague. Look at this part, Mark 7:31. Then he returned from the region of Tyre, and Tyre is here, and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee. Why would Jesus do that? Okay, from Tyre to Sidon to the Sea of Galilee. Is it the shortest way possible? And then in the region of the Decapolis, there, Decapolis is here. So apparently the one who wrote this gospel was not very keen on Palestinian geography. Okay, and then it implies a mission to the Gentiles. At the end of Mark 13, 9 to 10, you read in verse 10, and the good news must first be proclaimed to all nations. Okay. Now, the question is, who wrote Mark? And you would readily say Mark. And perhaps with that, you're following what has been in traditional attribution from the 2nd century, that the one who wrote the gospel is Mark, the follower and interpreter of Peter, and identified as the John Mark of Acts, whose mother had the house in Jerusalem. He accompanied Barnabas and Paul on the first missionary journey and may have helped Peter and Paul in Rome in the 60s. Okay, so that's in tradition and even quoted in the Fathers of the Church writings. Some who rejected this attribution allowed that the author may have been an otherwise unknown Christian named Mark. Marcus is a Roman name, and so it's something common. So that's by tradition, okay? It's Mark, the disciple of Peter, interpreter of Peter also. Now, the author can be detected also from the contents, that if you read the gospel, you would guess. Definitely a Greek speaker, and definitely not an eyewitness of Jesus's ministry, and because he's somebody who's not familiar with Palestinian geography. And he drew on pre-shaped traditions about Jesus, oral and probably written, and addressed himself to a community that seemingly had undergone persecution and failure. Okay? Now, about external evidence, who wrote which gospel, we find this from Irenaeus of Lyon, Adversus Hereses, okay? And that is about AD 180 to 200. And we read from this work. Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. So that was 180 to 200. So 2nd to 3rd century. And this was from the writings of one of the fathers of the church. And if you know, Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp of Smyrna, who was a disciple of John. Okay. Now, where? The guess is Rome. Okay, Rome or Italy. Okay? And there are a lot of reasons for that. Okay? Why? External evidence. Okay? First Peter would speak about that cryptic greeting Babylon. Okay? To my son Mark, and Babylon could be Rome. To his son Mark, and that means Mark is there in Rome. Internal evidence. Okay? By the way, when we speak about external evidence, it's what others would say about the author. So the evidence can be found from outside sources saying that, okay, Mark is the author, okay, or this is the author of the Gospel of Mark. If we see internal evidence, okay, for example, we say that it's Rome, we glean it from the clues that are in the Gospel itself. So for example, Mark 10, 11 to 12, teaching on divorce betrays a Roman background. Divorce was common then in the Roman setting. Mark 12:42, widows might quadrantes. It's not used in Syria and Galilee, that measure of money, okay, that measure of currency. Quadrantes is very Roman, very Latin. And then there are a large number of Latinisms, Greek terms or phrases that reflect Latin. In the same way that our Tagalog has a lot of Anglicisms. And when we speak in English, there are a lot of Tagalisms, okay? A setting where both Latin and Greek were used, therefore. So where was that? In Rome. Okay? O'Grady, an author, no? He said their mixed cultures often borrowed words. So there was borrowing. So it could be, that could be somehow a refutation of that, okay? But borrowing happens in every language. And then the question of suffering. There was the persecution of Nero. Okay? Now, when was it written? According to tradition, Mark wrote his gospel after Peter's death, AD 64. Mark 13 contains a prediction of the destruction of the temple. And you read that. I think I asked you to read the whole of the Gospel of Mark. Mark 13 would be about that, a prediction of the destruction of the temple. But it has parallels in Matthew and Luke. And Matthew and Luke wrote after the event, and that was 70 AD, and were to some extent altered to fit the known facts. The one of Mark 13 appears to be a prediction before the event. Maybe they saw the imminence of that event, and so he wrote about it. So accordingly, Mark is commonly dated between AD 65 to 70. Okay? Now, about this one, okay, looking at Mark 13, it's the apocalyptic discourse by Jesus. There was a lively hope that the end time was about to occur. And then Jesus, the Son of Man, was soon to return. Okay? That was their belief. He was soon to return. And so, does it presuppose the destruction of Jerusalem temple? Or does it merely suggest that the end was imminent? And there's no decisive evidence on this. That persecution has begun or is about to begin. And therefore, this is probably during the period of the Jewish War, 66 to 70, that when you compare it with the one of Luke, destruction has not yet taken place in Mark. Like, for example, you see, Mark 13:14, when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand, then those in the Judea must flee to the mountains, etc. The desolating sacrifice, what could that be? Could that have been the sacrilege that the Romans did to the temple? Did they put there a statue of the emperor or a statue of the Roman gods? So there, that's the desolating sacrilege or abomination. Now, furthermore, they see the end. Why? A lot of things were happening at this time. The year of Great Terror, 69 AD. The years prior to 69 were apocalyptic in character. 64 AD, we know about this. Nero persecutes the Christians in Rome. And it reflects somehow persecutions in chapter 13, verse 14. Of course, this one is not in the gospel, the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. It happened around that time, 64 AD. 66 AD, the Jewish revolt begins. So another troubling event. 68 AD, okay, Nero's suicide, and there was a bloody civil war. And there were 3 emperors at the same time, Galba, Otto, and Vitellius. And then there was also an earthquake in Italy. So a lot of events pointing out the end could be near. And then let's now go to the structure of the gospel. It's very easy to put it there, okay, to have it in your mind. You can divide it into 4. The ministry in Galilee, so Galilee, and then beyond Galilee, and then it's a journey, Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem, and then in Jerusalem. That is the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So see that? Again, Galilee, beyond Galilee, Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem, and then in Jerusalem. Okay. Now, we look at the structure of the gospel now in detail. Look at this. Very neat. So we have the introduction, 1 to 13, and then the mystery of the Messiah. Who is Jesus? Jesus and his people, Jesus and his own, Jesus and his disciples. And then there's a turning point. We call it the hinge, as I said. It's the confession of Peter. And then we see the mystery of the Son of Man from 831 onwards. So the way of the Son of Man, the judgment of Jerusalem, and then the passion and resurrection. And then we have the appendix, the apparitions of the risen Christ. This is another way to put it, okay? If you're fond of what is called the chiasm when we go to the style of the structure of many of the works in the Bible. So it's like this, okay? The chiasm is how you begin is how you end, more or less, okay? And then in between there are parallels, the penultimate with the second, and then still within, and then you have a middle point. So let's look at it. A1 and A2 in the desert, and then at the end you have at the tomb. You have the corresponding verses there. And then you have the first hinge, because B1 would be about Galilee, okay? And then B2 in Jerusalem. So those two, Galilee, Jerusalem. And in between Jerusalem and the tomb, you have the second hinge. In between, in the desert and in Galilee, you have the first hinge. And then Z1, blindness to sight. And then Z2, another blindness to sight. Okay? Healing of blind people. And then in the middle, you have on the way. And that is the journey, 827 to 1045. By the way, this phrase is very often used by Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, on the way, entohodos. Entohodo in Greek, entohodo. And it's on the way because they were on a journey, and sometimes, and if people will be following Jesus, it's on the way. Okay. So it gives us a semblance of a journey. Okay, now let's go to the style in the Gospel of Mark. This is very interesting. There's Greek rhetoric, okay? How do we see this, okay? The prose of Mark is unimpressive. And since we say that Matthew and Luke take Mark as their source, they often corrected the prose of Mark. And then the narrative technique, he always uses this word here on top, euthus, okay, euthus. What does it mean? Immediately. So he gives his narrative a frantic quality. It's like, in Tagalog, no? Ito yung nangyari. Tapos noon, ganito kaagad. Tapos nito, ganito kaagad. So it's like a running, okay? Frantic quality connected by and, kai. Okay? Kai. Kai is the word. In rapid succession. Tapos ganito, tapos ganito, tapos ganito. And the deeds are recounted vividly. And then, he's fond of slipping into the historical present. It's like past, and then he puts it in the present, in the middle of the story, giving it a sense of immediacy. So that is the style, okay? Another point. He helps his readers by translating Aramaic words into Greek. So he places first the Greek or the Aramaic that is already Hellenized, put into Greek, like Boanerges, okay? And then he gives an explanation. So Boanerges, which means sons of thunder, Talita kum, which means little girl, get up, Korban, which means gift, Golgotha, which means skull. Okay, so there are explanations that he gives. And he also puts in an incident that is presented in you guys. He repeats. So he makes his readers look twice. For example, coming of the sea, 2 times the Lord does that. The feeding of the multitude, there are 2 accounts in this gospel. The healing of the blind beggars, there are 2 healings of the blind here. Okay. Now, you find also 3 set patterns. Like, for example, here's the ABA structure, ABA prime, okay? So that is Mark's framing technique. 2 fragments of the same story, sandwich a third. So there's a story that is continued in first layer, that is continued in a third layer, and in the middle, you have another story. Okay, like for example, the one written there below, chapter 3, verses 20 to 35, first verses 20 to 21, the family of Jesus thinks that he's crazy. And then in between 22 to 30, accusation against Jesus that he has an unclean spirit. And then 31 to 35, he refuses to see his family. And there are others. Just look there. One thing that you could remember also when he raised up the daughter of Jairus, Jairus comes in, asks for his help. And then on the way, there's the hemorrhaging woman who touched the tassel of his cloak. And then he feels it, and the woman is healed. And then go back to Jairus. He raises the daughter of Jairus. Okay. Now see also these following. Yeah, you see these following passages. Okay. Now 3 set patterns also, progressive threefold grouping. Look at that first column, A, B, and A prime. 1:11, you are my beloved son, with you I'm well pleased, baptism. 9:7, this is my beloved son, listen to him. That is the transfiguration. And then 15:39, the centurion proclaims, this man was the Son of God. See, Son of God, that theme 3 times. If you want to go to the call of about the disciples, okay, the call of the first disciples, 1:16 to 20, 3:13 to 19, appointment of the 12. And then 6:7 to 13, the mission of the 12. And then look at that. The passion prediction, first passion prediction, 8:31. Second, I just correct this one. Second passion prediction, 9:31. 10:33, the third passion prediction, which we have seen. Now see also 14:32 to 42, which is this, 3. Okay, 3 times. The isolation of Jesus was dramatized in 3 steps. This is the prayer at Gethsemane. So he moves away from the disciples, from the chosen 3, and then falls to the earth. 3 steps. And then he beseeches the Father 3 times to take the cup from him. And the disciples were found asleep 3 times. And then Jesus accepts God's will and proclaims that now the Son of Man is to be given to a sinner, which was predicted 3 times. See? 3. Okay, now we go to Mark's delineation of character. That he uses various messianic titles in meaningful combinations: Christ, teacher, Lord, Son of God, Son of Man. And then, what about Jesus' actions? In terms of ancient thaumaturges or sages, meaning what he was doing reflects what has been written before, what has been done before by great people, by sages. And then the language of the Torah also, it connects Jesus' teaching to earlier scriptural stories. So deeper resonances to the story of Jesus himself, that he somehow is a fulfillment of that, of the Torah. And then interactions between characters. You would see this. The character is somehow revealed when there's that the tension, the dialogue, Jesus and the scribes, Jesus and others, Jesus and his disciples. Okay, let's now look into some passages that are unique to Mark's gospel, and this is very revealing. Why? Because over 90% of Mark is included in Matthew and about 50% included in Luke. We saw that. So there are very few passages that are unique in Mark. Okay, so for example, from the introduction, this is the one that's unique, the beginning of the good news. And then Jesus, only he has that title that we've read a while ago. And then Jesus being with the wild beasts during temptation, during the temptations, okay? And then miracles, just look at these: healing of the deaf mute in the Decapolis, healing of the blind man in Bethsaida in 2 stages, conversation with father of demonized boy, throwing himself to the fire, boy being like a corpse and people thinking he was dead, and then the kind of demon that cannot come out, that can come out only through prayer. So those are unique in Mark. And then there are other incidents during the ministry, like the calling of the disciples to the mountain to preach and then casting out demons, and then the family of Jesus trying to restrain him. These are unique in Mark. And then eyewitness details, like Jesus being asleep on a cushion during the storm. That is a detail in that miracle. And then those words, peace, be still to the storm, unique in Mark. The details about the strength of the Gerasene demoniac, that's also unique. And Jesus being aware that power had gone from him when healing the woman with the bleeding. And then these were not copied by either Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Departure to Tyre and entering a house, not wanting anyone to know that he was there. And then Jesus being indignant when the disciples sent the children away. So these are unique in Mark. Now, what about the parables? 2 are unique in Mark. The parable of the seed growing secretly, and then the analogy of a man going on a journey and leaving the doorkeeper to be on watch. Now, about the teaching and the comments, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And then John and James and John being given the name Boanerges, sons of thunder. And then everyone salted with fire. Salt loses its saltiness, okay? And be at peace. That's something that's unique in Mark. Blessings including persecutions for those who give up everything, okay? 10:30. And then scribes replied to Jesus about the importance of loving God and neighbor. So that reply that he gave him, that's in chapter 12, verses 32 to 34, okay? And then this is interesting. During the Passion and Resurrection. Now here, try to see this. Chapter 14, verses 51 to 52, the naked young man running away. That's unique in Mark. Why? Okay. Perhaps it's something that was witnessed. And you know, I'd like to connect this with the call, okay? At the beginning, Jesus called his disciples, and so they left their nets for Andrew and Peter, and then for James and John, their father, and the boat. So they left these things to follow Jesus. Now, this young man would be ready to leave his clothes just to be away from Jesus. And then also, Pilate asking whether Jesus was already dead, okay? But before that, even naming the Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. It's unique in Mark that he names these two, Alexander and Rufus. Perhaps they were known to the community of Mark. And then the question about who will roll away the stone in the resurrection scene. And then the disciples afraid and not telling anyone. Something more about this in a little while, okay? Now, another thing that's unique in the Passion narrative is this. Mark 15:26, the inscription. What is the inscription in Mark? Ho Basileus ton Judaion, the king of the Jews. That if you compare it with the others, okay, if you compare it with the Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, the one of Mark is, the king of the Jews. The one of Luke O Basileus ton Judayon, hutos, this is the King of the Jews. The one of Matthew is, hutos estin Jesus o Basileus to Judayon, to ton Judayon, okay? So this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. And then John, Jesus o Nazarayos o Basileus ton Judayon, okay? Okay, that is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And you see, that's the inscription in the INRI. It's from John. Okay, the description in the cross, the INRI. It is Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum. Jesus the Nazarene or Nazarene, King of the Jews. Now, let's go to the ending of Mark. Okay, let's go to the last chapter. That is 16 and then 8 verses. Okay. So Jesus's hasty burial led the women early on Sunday morning after the Sabbath to buy spices to anoint him. The tomb is open, and the young man, almost certainly an angel, is there, but not the body of Jesus. So you see that scene. Okay? And the decisive announcement, he has been raised. He is going before you to Galilee where you will see him. And that represents the triumph of the Son of Man predicted 3 times by Jesus. Okay? So you find it 1 to 8. Okay? Now, go to verse 8. The reaction of the women is astounding. Disobeying the young man's command to tell the disciples and Peter, they say nothing to anyone out of fear. So you see that is what's, if you would say that that's the ending, it's so discouraging. And yet, many scholars would say that's the ending of Mark. That even the theology is consistent. Even a proclamation of the resurrection does not produce faith without the hearer's personal encounter with suffering and carrying the cross. So that's very important. And that's why it's a question. Is that the real ending? If you look at your gospel, oh, Father, there's something else, okay, that follows. And that's what we call the longer ending. So what is there? An ending describing resurrection appearances appended by later copies. So that is verses 9 to 20. So most scholars believe that, yeah, Mark ends with verse 8 in chapter 16. But there are some scholars who contend that there was a lost ending. Why? Because why would the gospel end that way? And already in antiquity, they already felt this very awkward. That's why that brought copies to provide 3 different endings in an attempt to correct the abruptness of chapter 16, verse 8. And this is the best and attested ending, 9 to 20. That's called the Markan Appendix or the longer ending. So it records 3 appearances to Mary Magdalene, okay, to 2 disciples, and to all 11 of the risen Jesus. So those 3 appearances. And then his ascension into heaven and his sitting at God's right hand. And that is how the Gospel of Mark ends. You know, dear friends, there's still a lot that can be said about this, but I think this is a good introduction for all of us. Very, it's concise. And I know there will be more questions when we meet face to face. And so with this, I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and let's discuss more when we meet each other on Saturday. God bless you.